Durango, Colorado. 1883. The mountain air bit at Elizabeth Olsen's cheeks as she stepped from the train onto the wooden platform, her gloved hands trembling against the handle of her small valise. The journey from Boston had been interminable. 5 days of soot, strange faces, and the endless clacking of wheels that matched her racing heart. She scanned the station, searching for a face she knew only from a daguerreotype sent 3 months prior. Harold Jensen, her mail-order groom, had written such beautiful letters, promises of a comfortable home, a thriving cattle business, and the kind of security a 23-year-old orphan schoolteacher from Massachusetts could only dream about. When she spotted him, her breath caught. He stood taller than she'd imagined, broad-shouldered in a fine wool coat, surrounded by 3 other men. His blonde hair gleamed beneath a fashionable derby hat. Elizabeth smoothed her navy traveling dress, tugged at the collar of her practical coat, and stepped forward. "Mr. Jensen," she called, her voice carrying across the platform. Harold turned, and the change that came over his face stole the warmth from her body more efficiently than the Colorado winter. His eyes widened, then narrowed. His companions leaned in, whispering something that made Harold's lips twist into a cruel smile. Then he laughed. The sound cut through the bustle of the station like a knife. "Miss Olsen," he called back, his voice carrying enough for nearby passengers to turn and stare. "My God, the photograph you sent must have been taken a decade ago." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. The photograph had been taken just last year, and while she knew she was no great beauty, she had been told she possessed a pleasant countenance. Her brown hair was neatly arranged, her figure slender but womanly beneath her sensible clothing. I do not understand," she stammered, clutching her valise tighter as Harold and his friends approached. "You understand perfectly well," Harold replied, his voice dropping. "You misrepresented yourself, madam. I require a wife who will make an advantageous impression upon my business associates." His eyes raked over her dismissively. "You are not what I was promised." One of his companions, a ruddy-faced man with a handlebar mustache, chuckled. "Maybe she's better suited for the miners' camp, Harold." Elizabeth took a step backward, bumping into another passenger. The insult stung like a physical blow. "Sir, I have traveled nearly 2,000 miles, and I suggest you purchase a return ticket immediately," Harold interrupted. "I will not be saddled with a plain Jane who cannot even dress appropriately for her station. Good day, Miss Olsen." With that, he tipped his hat mockingly and turned away, his friends following in his wake, their laughter hanging in the air like smoke. Elizabeth stood frozen, her carpet-bag clutched to her chest, as tears blurred her vision. The late afternoon sun glinted off the snow-capped mountains beyond the town, beautiful and utterly indifferent to her plight. 5 days by train, her entire savings spent, and nowhere to go in a strange town as twilight approached. A shadow fell across her face, and she looked up to find a tall man regarding her with concerned eyes the color of summer sage. "Ma'am," he said quietly, removing his worn leather hat to reveal dark hair streaked with copper. "I couldn't help but overhear." Elizabeth blinked rapidly, willing her tears not to fall before a stranger. "It is nothing, sir. A misunderstanding." The man's weathered face remained grave. "That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was cruelty." He hesitated, then extended a calloused hand. "Vincent Walker. I own a ranch about 10 miles south of here." She did not take his hand. "Elizabeth Olsen. And I should be going. I need to inquire about." She glanced toward the ticket office, the reality of her situation crashing down upon her. She had exactly $4.27 remaining, not nearly enough for a return ticket to Boston. As if reading her thoughts, Mr. Walker spoke again. "Miss Olsen, Durango's a decent town, but it's no place for a lady alone with night coming on." He gestured toward a nearby bench. "Would you sit a moment? I might have a proposition that could help us both." Every lesson in propriety screamed against accepting such an offer, but desperation made Elizabeth bold. She perched on the edge of the bench, keeping a proper distance between them. Vincent Walker settled his tall frame beside her, placing his hat on his knee. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, a man who spent his days beneath the sun and the neat trim of his beard. His clothes were not fine like Harold Jensen's, but they were clean and well-maintained. A simple button-up shirt beneath a sheepskin coat, sturdy denim trousers, and boots that had seen years of honest work. I've got a spread, he began, his voice deep and measured. Nothing fancy, but it's growing. 500 acres, decent water rights, and about 200 head of cattle. Why are you telling me this, Mr. Walker? Elizabeth asked, clutching her handkerchief. He studied the wooden planks beneath their feet. Because I need a teacher for my boy. The statement took her by surprise. Your son? Vincent nodded. Samuel. He's 10. Smart as a whip, but wild as the country. His mother passed when he was 4. Influenza. His jaw tightened momentarily. I've been meaning to find someone to school him proper, but good teachers are scarce out here, especially ones willing to live so far from town. Elizabeth considered his words. You're offering me employment? Room and board, plus $20 a month, he said. It's not much, but it would give you time to decide your next steps. He looked at her directly then. No strings attached, Miss Olsen. You'd have your own quarters in the house, meals provided. Samuel needs learning, and you need a safe place to land. And how do I know you're a man of honor, Mr. Walker? She asked, years of Eastern caution making her wary. For the first time, a smile touched his lips, not unkind, like Harold's, but gentle. You don't. But Sheriff Haynes over there. He nodded toward a graying man pinning a notice to the station wall. He can vouch for me. As can Reverend Miller, if he's still in his office at the church down the street. Elizabeth watched as a cowboy watched her cry, offering not mockery, but something far more valuable, dignity and possibility. I'll need references, she said firmly. And a contract, in writing. Vincent Walker nodded solemnly. I'd expect nothing less from an educated woman. As the mountain shadows lengthened across Durango, Elizabeth Olsen made the first of many decisions that would change the course of her life. She would not return to Boston defeated. She would not let Harold Jensen's cruelty define her worth. She would accept Mr. Walker's offer, cautiously, properly, and she would teach his son. She could never have imagined that this decision, born of necessity and desperation, would lead to so much more. The Walker Ranch sprawled across a valley nestled between pine-covered hills, more modest than Elizabeth had imagined, but undeniably beautiful. The main house was a sturdy 2-story structure of hewn logs with a wide porch and glass windows, luxuries that spoke of patient building over time. A barn, bunkhouse, and several outbuildings completed the small compound, smoke curling from chimneys against the crisp December sky. Vincent guided the wagon to a stop before the house. It's not much compared to Boston, he said, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. It's lovely, Elizabeth replied honestly. She had spent the journey from town in a state of nervous anticipation, questioning her decision with every mile they traveled farther from civilization. But Sheriff Haynes had indeed vouched for Vincent Walker, calling him one of the most decent men in the county, and the written agreement they'd drawn up with the town lawyer was fair and straightforward. A boy burst through the front door, all gangly limbs and unruly dark hair. He skidded to a halt at the sight of Elizabeth, his expression shifting from excitement to wariness. Sam, Vincent called, jumping down from the wagon seat. Come meet Miss Olsen. She's going to be your teacher. Samuel Walker approached cautiously, studying Elizabeth with intelligent eyes that matched his father's. His clothes were clean but showed the signs of a boy who spent his days outdoors, patches at the knees, a frayed collar. How do you do, Samuel? Elizabeth said, accepting Vincent's help down from the wagon. The boy gave a stiff little bow that suggested someone had taught him manners, even if they were rusty from disuse. Are you really a teacher, ma'am? I am. I taught at the Beacon Hill Academy for Girls in Boston for 3 years. Samuel wrinkled his nose. Girls? Elizabeth smiled despite her fatigue. Girls need education just as boys do. But I assure you, the curriculum is quite similar. Do you know about dinosaur bones? He asked suddenly. They found some over in Morrison. Pa promised we'd go see them someday. Before she could answer, the front door opened again, and an older woman with silver-streaked black hair and dark eyes appeared, wiping her hands on an apron. This is Mrs. Ramirez, Vincent explained. She helps with the cooking and housekeeping 3 days a week. Mrs. Ramirez, Miss Olsen has agreed to be Sam's teacher. The woman gave Elizabeth a warm smile. Gracias a Dios, she said fervently. This boy needs learning before his brain turns to tumbleweeds. Her English carried the musical lilt of her native Spanish, but was clear and precise. Vincent took Elizabeth's valise. Sam, help bring in Miss Olsen's trunk. Mrs. Ramirez has supper nearly ready, and I expect our new teacher is hungry after her journey. The interior of the house surprised Elizabeth. Though certainly not as refined as the Boston homes she knew, it was comfortable and well-maintained. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, surrounded by simple but sturdy furniture. Bookshelves lined one wall, not merely for show, she noted, but filled with well-worn volumes. Kerosene lamps cast a warm glow as twilight gathered outside. "Your room is upstairs, Miss Olsen," Vincent said. "First door on the right. Sam and I have rooms at the other end of the hall. The middle room we've set up as your classroom." Elizabeth followed him up the stairs, taking in her surroundings. Everything spoke of a home created with care, if not wealth. No fancy wallpapers or ornate moldings, but the wooden floors gleamed with polish, and colorful hand-woven rugs added warmth. The bedroom that would be hers was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a washstand, and a window that would overlook the valley when daylight came. Someone, Mrs. Ramirez, she presumed, had placed a small vase of dried wildflowers on the windowsill. "I hope this will be suitable," Vincent said, setting down her valise. "It's perfectly adequate, thank you," Elizabeth replied, removing her gloves and bonnet. "May I freshen up before supper?" "Of course. There's water in the pitcher, and the necessary is through that door at the end of the hall. We brought it inside last year." Luxury of luxuries. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "We'll wait for you downstairs." Left alone, Elizabeth sank onto the edge of the bed, the enormity of her situation washing over her. 24 hours ago, she had been on a train, heart full of hope for a new life with Harold Jensen. Now she found herself in a remote ranch house with a taciturn widower and his wild son, committed to stay at least through the winter. She splashed cold water on her face, changed her collar for a fresh one, and repinned her hair. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she would face her new employers with dignity. Supper was a simple but hearty affair. Venison stew, fresh bread, and preserved peaches, served at a rectangular oak table in the kitchen. Mrs. Ramirez joined them, her presence easing some of Elizabeth's discomfort at dining alone with two males. The conversation was initially stilted, with Samuel answering her questions in monosyllables while stealing curious glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking. "Miss Olsen was asking about your interests, Sam," Vincent prompted when the boy fell silent again. "Tell her about your collection." Samuel's face brightened. "I collect arrowheads and interesting rocks. Found a quartz crystal last month that's near as big as my fist." His reserve cracked. He launched into an enthusiastic description of his treasures and where he'd found them. Elizabeth listened attentively, her teacher's instincts recognizing a curious mind that simply needed direction. "Perhaps we could incorporate your interest in geology and archaeology into your lessons," she suggested. "Science is not merely about memorizing facts, but understanding the world around us." "See, Sam? Just like I told you," Vincent said, his expression warming as he looked at his son. "Learning doesn't have to be all McGuffey readers and arithmetic, though you'll need those too." As Mrs. Ramirez cleared the dishes, declining Elizabeth's offer to help, "Not on your first night, señorita," Vincent pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. "I took the liberty of ordering some school books from Denver," he said, sliding the list toward her. "They should arrive on next week's stage. Is there anything else you'll need?" Elizabeth reviewed the list, impressed by his foresight. "Slates and chalk, certainly. Paper is precious, I know, but for certain exercises, order what you need," he interrupted gently. "Sam's education is important. It's why you're here." After supper, Vincent showed her the room that would serve as their classroom. A large table and chairs had been positioned to catch the morning light, and a proper blackboard hung on one wall. Bookshelves held a modest collection of volumes, some children's classics, reference books, and surprisingly, several volumes of poetry. "This was my wife's favorite," Vincent said quietly, noticing Elizabeth's attention on a well-worn copy of Tennyson. Catherine loved beautiful words. The mention of his late wife hung in the air between them, a reminder of the ghost that shaped this household. Elizabeth wondered what kind of woman Catherine Walker had been, to marry a rancher and make a home in this wild country. She must have been remarkable, Elizabeth offered. Vincent's eyes held a distant sadness. "She was much too fine for the likes of me, but she never seemed to notice." He cleared his throat. I'll leave you to settle in, Miss Olsen. Breakfast is at 6. We rise with the sun out here. That night, lying in a strange bed beneath unfamiliar quilts, Elizabeth listened to the profound silence of the countryside, so different from Boston's constant hum of activity. In the distance, a coyote called, answered by another. The vastness of her new situation pressed upon her. The endless sky she'd glimpsed from the wagon, the rugged mountains, and the uncertain future stretching before her. She thought of Harold Jensen's cruel laughter, of the humiliation that had nearly broken her on that train platform. Yet here she was, miles from anywhere familiar, but with a roof over her head and purpose restored to her days. As sleep finally claimed her, Elizabeth wondered if perhaps this detour in her plans might prove a blessing in disguise. Winter settled over the Walker Ranch with a fierce determination, bringing snowdrifts taller than Samuel and temperatures that froze the creek solid. Elizabeth adapted to ranch life with a pragmatism that surprised even herself. Her days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Breakfast with Vincent and Samuel, morning lessons, afternoon chores, and evenings by the fire with books or mending. Samuel proved to be a bright, if sometimes reluctant, student. His natural curiosity made science and history lessons a joy, though he balked at grammar and penmanship. Elizabeth quickly learned that relating academic subjects to the practical world of ranching captured his attention. Calculating the dimensions of fence posts became a geometry lesson. The migration patterns of local wildlife served as natural science. "You've got away with him," Vincent observed one evening in late January, as they sat by the fire after Samuel had gone to bed. Outside, snow fell in heavy curtains, the wind whistling around the eaves. "He's actually excited about learning now." Elizabeth looked up from her mending, one of Samuel's endless supply of torn shirts. "He's an intelligent boy who simply needs to understand why knowledge matters. Abstract concepts mean little to a child who lives in such a tangible world." Vincent nodded, his attention returning to the leather bridle he was repairing. In the months since her arrival, Elizabeth had come to appreciate his quiet competence. The way his large hands could be brutally strong when wrestling a calf or delicate when splinting a bird's broken wing that Samuel had found. "You never speak of returning east," he said suddenly, his eyes still on his work. The question caught Elizabeth off guard. She had written to her former employer in Boston shortly after arriving, explaining her circumstances and requesting a reference should she need it in the future. But as winter deepened, thoughts of leaving had receded like the distant mountains behind snow clouds. "I suppose I haven't given it much consideration lately," she admitted. Elizabeth gave a tired laugh. "I've learned that life rarely conforms to the rules of propriety we're taught back east." She looked down at her soiled clothing. "Though I fear this apron may be beyond salvation." "I'll buy you a dozen new ones," Vincent replied, and something in his tone made her look up. He was watching her with an intensity that sent warmth spreading through her chest, his green eyes soft with an emotion she hadn't seen before. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities. The moment broke when Samuel called from across the barn. Vincent cleared his throat, offering a hand to help her up. "You should go change before that dries," he said practically. Elizabeth nodded, acutely aware of his calloused fingers around hers, even through the mess of the calving. "Yes, of course." As she made her way back to the house, she wondered if she had imagined that look, or if Vincent Walker, reserved, proper Vincent, might be struggling with the same inappropriate feelings that troubled her own heart. The following Sunday, the entire household made the journey into Durango for church services, a monthly ritual when weather permitted. Elizabeth welcomed these excursions, not only for the spiritual refreshment, but for the chance to interact with other women and maintain connections to the wider community. After the service, while Samuel played with other children in the churchyard, Elizabeth found herself cornered by Harriet Palmer, the wife of Durango's bank manager and a notorious gossip. "My dear Miss Olsen," Mrs. Palmer said, her voice pitched to carry despite her conspiratorial lean. "How are you finding your position with the Walkers? Such an unusual arrangement for a single woman." Elizabeth maintained her composure. "It's a perfectly respectable position, Mrs. Palmer. Mr. Walker has been most proper, and Samuel is a delightful student." Of course," the older woman said, patting Elizabeth's arm. "Though I must tell you, there's been talk." A handsome widower and a pretty young teacher under the same roof. Well, people will speculate. People should mind their own affairs, came Vincent's deep voice from behind them. Mrs. Palmer startled, her cheeks flushing. Mr. Walker, I was just telling Miss Olsen how fortunate Samuel is to have such a dedicated teacher. Vincent's expression remained neutral, but Elizabeth saw the tightness around his eyes. Indeed he is. If you'll excuse us, Mrs. Palmer, our wagon is ready. As they walked away, Elizabeth felt a curious mixture of embarrassment and indignation. I'm sorry if my presence is causing difficulties for your reputation, she said quietly when they were out of earshot. Vincent stopped, turning to face her. It's not your reputation I'm concerned about, Elizabeth. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the spring breeze. People will always talk, he continued. It doesn't signify. But Elizabeth knew better. In small communities like Durango, reputation was currency. A whisper could become truth through repetition alone. If her presence at the ranch cast shadows on Vincent's character or, worse, on Samuel's legitimacy in the community, she could not in good conscience remain. Perhaps we should consider alternative arrangements, she suggested reluctantly. I could take a room in town and Samuel could, no. Vincent's response was immediate and firm. Unless you're unhappy at the ranch. Not at all, Elizabeth admitted. But your standing in the community is secure enough to withstand idle gossip. His eyes held her steadily. Unless you feel your own reputation is at risk. Elizabeth thought of her life before coming west. The rigid social structures of Boston society. The narrow path acceptable for a woman of her position. Here in Colorado, she had found a freedom unimaginable there, despite the physical hardships and isolation. I've never much cared for society's arbitrary rules, she said finally. But I would not wish to bring difficulty to you or Samuel. Something like a smile touched Vincent's lips. Then we're in agreement. The arrangements remain as they are. The matter seemed settled, but as they drove back to the ranch, Elizabeth sensed a new tension between them, not unpleasant, but charged with awareness. Mrs. Palmer's insinuations had forced into the open the undercurrent that had been building since winter. They were not merely employer and employee, but a man and woman increasingly drawn to each other. How long they might have continued in this state of unacknowledged attraction, Elizabeth never discovered, for fate intervened 3 weeks later in the form of an unexpected letter. Elizabeth was supervising Samuel's mathematics lesson on the porch, enjoying the late May sunshine, when Vincent returned from his weekly trip to town for supplies. Among the parcels and mail was an envelope addressed to her in a familiar hand. It's from Harold Jensen, she said in surprise, staring at the heavy stationery. Vincent's expression darkened at the name. Though she had shared little about her disastrous meeting with her intended groom, he knew enough to harbor a particular dislike for the man. What does he want? He asked, his tone carefully neutral. Elizabeth broke the seal and scanned the contents, her eyebrows rising with each paragraph. He apologizes for his behavior and wishes to make amends. He says he was unwell that day, overtired from business concerns, and spoke rashly. She looked up, incredulous. He asks if I would consider meeting with him again, with a view to renewing our understanding. Vincent's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He's coming to Durango next week on business, Elizabeth continued, and wishes to call upon me. She folded the letter, her emotions in turmoil. After months of putting the humiliation behind her, Harold Jensen's words reopened wounds she thought had healed. Will you see him? Vincent asked, his voice unnaturally even. Elizabeth hesitated. The practical part of her mind whispered that this was exactly what she had originally traveled west for. Marriage to an established businessman, security, respectability. Yet the thought of facing Harold again, of allowing him to sweep aside his cruelty with facile excuses, made her stomach clench. More than that, the idea of leaving the ranch, of leaving Vincent and Samuel, created a hollow ache in her chest she couldn't ignore. I don't know, she answered honestly. I need to think. Vincent nodded once, sharply. Of course. It's your decision. He turned away, his shoulders rigid. I should check on the new fencing in the north pasture. Sam, mind your sums for Miss Olsen. Elizabeth watched him stride toward the barn, the letter heavy in her hands. For the first time since arriving at the Walker Ranch, she felt truly uncertain of her place there. That evening, Vincent was uncharacteristically silent at supper, responding to Samuel's chatter with distracted monosyllables. When the boy had gone up to bed, Elizabeth found Vincent on the porch, staring out at the darkening mountains. "I've decided to meet with Mr. Jensen," she said quietly, stepping beside him at the railing. Vincent's profile remained impassive. "I see. I owe it to myself to hear what he has to say," Elizabeth continued, "to close that chapter properly." Now he turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face. "And if he offers what you came west for? Security, position, a ready-made life in town?" The question hung between them, laden with all they had not said these past months. "That's not why I'm meeting him," Elizabeth said carefully. "Then why?" "Because I need to face him as the woman I am now, not the desperate, humiliated girl who stood on that platform in December." She took a deep breath. "I'm not the same person who stepped off that train, Vincent. This place, Samuel, you, have changed me." Something shifted in his expression. "Changed you how?" Elizabeth chose her words carefully, aware they were approaching a threshold that, once crossed, would alter everything between them. "I've learned that worth isn't measured by social standing or others' approval. That there's dignity in honest work, however humble. That family can be built, not just born into." She met his gaze directly. "That sometimes the path you didn't choose leads exactly where you need to be." Vincent stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, smell the clean scent of soap and leather that always clung to him. "And where is it you need to be, Elizabeth?" Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I think you know." For a moment, he simply looked at her, and Elizabeth feared she had misread everything between them. Then his hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch impossibly gentle for a man who wrestled calves and felled trees. "I have no right to ask you to stay," he said, his voice low and rough. "I'm just a rancher with calloused hands and modest prospects. I can't offer you the life Jensen might." Elizabeth covered his hand with her own, keeping it against her face. "I don't want the life he offers," she whispered. "I want this one. Here." Vincent's other arm slipped around her waist, drawing her closer. "Are you certain? This life is hard, Elizabeth. The winters are brutal, the work never ends, and town is always 10 miles away." She smiled up at him. "I've noticed these things. And still you would choose it?" "Choose him." Elizabeth rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his, silencing his doubts with a boldness that would have scandalized her former self. Vincent froze for the briefest moment before responding with a fervor that made her knees weaken, his arms tightening around her, as if he feared she might disappear. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since February," he admitted. "Maybe January." Elizabeth laughed softly. "I believe I've wanted you to since Christmas." His expression grew serious again. "I still think you should meet Jensen." She drew back slightly, surprised. "You do?" Vincent nodded. "Not because I have any doubt about what's between us, but because I want you to be absolutely certain. No regrets, no wondering what might have been." His eyes held hers intently. "If you choose me, choose us. I want it to be with your whole heart, knowing all your options." Elizabeth marveled at the selflessness of the man before her, so different from Harold Jensen's casual cruelty. "Very well," she agreed. "I'll meet with him. But Vincent," she placed her hand over his heart, feeling its strong, steady beat beneath her palm, "my decision is already made." The following Thursday, Elizabeth sat in the parlor of Durango's only hotel, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she waited for Harold Jensen. She had taken particular care with her appearance, wearing her best dress of deep blue wool and arranging her hair in a simple but becoming style. When Harold entered, she was struck by how different he seemed from her memory. Still handsome in a conventional way, still expensively dressed, but somehow smaller than the figure that had loomed so large in her nightmares these past months. "Miss Olsen," he said, removing his hat. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." Elizabeth nodded coolly. "Mr. Jensen." He settled into the chair across from her, his manner betraying a confidence that bordered on smugness. "You're looking well. Country life clearly agrees with you." "Yes, it does," she replied simply. Harold leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I must apologize for my behavior when you arrived. It was unconscionable. I had been under considerable strain. A business deal gone sour, too much whiskey the night before, and I took my frustrations out on you most unfairly." Elizabeth studied him, noting how his apology centered on his own circumstances rather than her feelings. It was indeed unfair, Mr. Jensen. Cruel, in fact. He had the grace to look momentarily abashed. Yes, well, I've had time to reconsider. Your letters revealed a woman of intelligence and refinement, qualities Durango sorely lacks. My business has expanded considerably since December, and I find myself more than ever in need of a suitable wife. A suitable wife, Elizabeth repeated, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. Harold smiled indulgently. You would have a comfortable home on Silverton Avenue. I've recently purchased the Hammond property. 2 servants, a monthly allowance for household expenses and personal items. I entertain business associates regularly, but otherwise your time would be your own. He paused, clearly expecting gratitude for such generosity. I understand you've been teaching the Walker boy? A commendable way to occupy yourself temporarily, but hardly a permanent situation for a woman of your background. Elizabeth felt a curious sense of calm settle over her as Harold outlined the life he offered. 6 months ago, it might have seemed a dream fulfilled, security, respectability, comfort. Now it sounded like a gilded cage. Mr. Jensen, she said when he finished, thank you for your candor. May I be equally forthright? He inclined his head magnanimously. Of course. When you rejected me at the station, I was devastated. I had spent my savings on the journey west, pinned all my hopes on beginning a new life as your wife. She met his gaze steadily. That rejection proved to be the greatest blessing of my life. Harold blinked, clearly not expecting this response. I beg your pardon. Had you welcomed me as promised, I would never have found my true place, my true purpose. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. I must decline your renewed offer, Mr. Jensen. I am engaged to be married to Vincent Walker. The shock on Harold's face would have been comical under different circumstances. Walker? The cattle rancher? My dear Miss Olsen, surely you cannot be serious. The man is barely civilized, living out in the wilderness, consorting with common laborers. Elizabeth rose, gathering her reticule. Mr. Walker is the finest man I have ever known. Honest, hard-working, and possessed of true integrity. Qualities that matter far more than fine clothing or business connections. She offered a polite smile. I wish you well in your search for a suitable wife, Mr. Jensen. Good day. She left him gaping in the hotel parlor, stepping into the sunshine with a lightness in her heart she hadn't felt in years. Whatever the future held with Vincent and Samuel, she knew with bone-deep certainty that she had chosen rightly. Vincent was waiting with the wagon outside the mercantile as arranged, his expression carefully neutral as she approached. How did it go? He asked, helping her up to the seat. Elizabeth settled beside him, her shoulder brushing his. Mr. Jensen offered me everything a sensible woman should want. A fine house, servants, social position. Vincent's hands tightened on the reins. I see. I declined, she said simply. He turned to look at her then, hope warring with uncertainty in his eyes. You're certain? That life would be easier than what I can offer. Elizabeth reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. I don't want easy, Vincent. I want real. I want purpose and honesty and work that matters. She smiled up at him. I want you and Samuel and our ranch. Our ranch, he repeated softly. If you'll have me. Vincent's answer came not in words but in action, as he pulled her into a kiss that left no doubt of his feelings, heedless of the townspeople passing by. When they broke apart, his smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I should warn you, he said, touching her cheek gently, that Samuel has already started calling you Ma, when you're not listening. Elizabeth laughed, joy bubbling up from some deep wellspring inside her. Then we shouldn't keep him waiting any longer. 2 months later, on a perfect July morning, Elizabeth Olsen became Elizabeth Walker in a simple ceremony at the Durango church. Samuel stood proudly as his father's best man. Mrs. Ramirez wept happily in the front pew, and even Sheriff Haynes was seen to dab at his eyes during the exchange of vows. If Harriet Palmer and her circle whispered about the hasty nature of the union, their gossip fell on deaf ears. The newlyweds had eyes only for each other and for the bright-eyed boy who would now officially call Elizabeth mother. As they emerged from the church into the brilliant Colorado sunshine, Vincent lifted Elizabeth into the decorated wagon that would carry them back to the ranch. No regrets, he asked quietly, his hand warm against hers. Elizabeth looked at her husband, this man who had watched her cry on a train platform and offered her not just shelter but a future. This man whose steady strength and quiet love had healed wounds she hadn't known she carried. Not one, she replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Samuel clambered up beside them, already chattering about the celebration Mrs. Ramirez had prepared back at the ranch. As the wagon pulled away from the church, Elizabeth caught a glimpse of Harold Jensen watching from across the street, his expression unreadable. She felt a momentary pang, not of regret, but of gratitude. His cruelty had set her on this unexpected path, leading her to the family she was meant to find. The mountains rose before them, blue and eternal against the sky as Vincent guided the horses homeward. Elizabeth leaned her head against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that sometimes life's greatest disappointments lead to its greatest joys, that a journey begun in humiliation could end in belonging, that the laughter of a callous man could ultimately lead to the love of a lifetime.